All right, government class, let's get going. Welcome back. I hope everybody had a great weekend, that you guys are staying safe. Be nice to your siblings. Don't drive your parents crazy. This is part three, the final chapter, talking about presidential bureaucracies, the federal bureaucracy, um, specifically the cabinet. So, you guys did a good job on your assignment from week three, day four. So we'll go through very quickly at the top of the PowerPoint and we'll just go through those answers again. And then we left off last week with the Department of Health and Human Services. So we'll pick back up there and then we'll finish out the cabinet today. And after that, later this week, we're going to start talking about a topic that should be pretty interesting, state and local government. We're going to start out specifically, we're going to look at the various positions within the state government. And after that, we're going to examine what goes on at the county and city level. When I worked at that nonprofit, I realized that a lot of decisions that affect our everyday lives are made at the state and local level. So I'm excited to look into that. But without further adieu, let's get going. So, really quickly, we went over this last week. State, Treasury, Attorney General, Defense, Interior, Agriculture, Commerce, Labor, Health and Human Services. This is where we're picking up today. Housing and Urban Development, Secretary of Transportation, Energy, Education, Veterans, Homeland. All right, so you guys told me when I asked you who developed foreign policy, advance freedom, create secure, beneficial world, State Department. Treasury, you told me that their mission was to collect revenue. Defense, you told me that their mission was to provide the military forces needed to deter war and protect the security of the United States. For the Justice Department, you told me that that enforces the law and defends the interest of the United States according to the law, prevent and control crime, and seeks just punishment for criminals. You told me for Interior that their mission was to protect and provide access to our nation's natural and cultural heritage and honor our trust responsibilities to Indian tribes and our commitments to island communities. Agriculture. This one's pretty easy, but you guys got it right. Formulate policy on farming, food, natural resources, maintain food safety, combat hunger worldwide. Commerce. Foster, serve, and promote the nation's economic development and technological advancement. Labor. Assure work safety, fair pay, unemployment insurance. Here we are, the Department of Health and Human Services. The mission of the Department of Health and Human Services is to protect the health of all Americans and provide essential human services, especially for those who are least able to help themselves. It was established in 1980. And remember, we talked about how there are like departments within departments within departments. Well, the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare were together for a while, but then they were split apart, and Health and Human Services was created. Oops, what am I doing? The first secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services was Oveta Kolpabi. She was a first commanding officer of the Women's Army Corps. So she was the first Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare. See, ladies, you're slowly getting a piece of the pie. Patricia Harris was secretary in 1980 under Jimmy Carter, Georgia's own Jimmy Carter. She was the first African American woman to serve in a cabinet position. We might dive into Patricia Harris later on this week. It's a really good story. Next, we come to the Department of Housing and Urban Development. That's usually called HUD. The mission of the Office of Housing, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, is to increase home ownership, support community development, and increase access to affordable housing. It was established in 1965 following the Department of Housing and Urban Development Act, and it was signed by LBJ, Lyndon B. Johnson, made it a cabinet level agency. The very first secretary, a guy named Robert Weaver, was the very first African American to serve in the U.S. cabinet. So Patricia Harris was the first female. Robert Weaver was the first African American. So Lyndon Johnson, he was, we haven't, I guess you guys will talk about this in U.S. history, but you probably already know, or you might. Lyndon Johnson took over for John F. Kennedy following Kennedy's assassination. Johnson was his VP. Kennedy tried to create something that very closely resembled the Housing and Urban Development Department, but Congress wouldn't put it through. Transportation. The DOT. The mission of the Department of Transportation is to ensure a fast, safe, efficient, accessible, and convenient transportation system. It was established October 15th, 1966, also by President Johnson. And the Department of Transportation they essentially brought 31 different agencies and bureaus together and put it all under the umbrella of the DOT. So Johnson is doing a lot in terms of expanding the federal bureaucracy, for better or worse. The first secretary of the DOT was a guy named Alan Stevenson Boyd. One thing, now we have federal motor vehicle standards. There are, states a lot of times have emission standards, but the federal government, uh, the Department of Transportation, they're in charge of federal level vehicle standards. This is kind of an interesting fun fact. I couldn't tell you why, but the DOT was in charge of daylight savings time, oversight of daylight savings time. I'm not sure why they were put in charge of that, or really what oversight of daylight saving times really means. It isn't here and then it gets here, but That just goes to show you when there's this much, when there are this many departments and bureaus, etc., some of them wind up with peculiar responsibilities. Department of Energy, pretty cool logo. The mission of the Department of Energy is to advance the national economic and energy security of the United States and promote scientific and technological innovation. President Carter established the Department of Energy in 1977 to centralize the government's energy policy in the wake of an oil crisis. We'll actually, once we get through this PowerPoint, we're going to look at Patricia Harris and Robert Weaver. And if we have time, we're going to look at that oil spill as well. Prior to the creation of the Department of Energy, there had not been any new cabinet positions for 11 years. So Johnson and Carter were both people who expanded the cabinet. Those are both Democratic presidents, which shouldn't surprise us too much, since by this point we know that, as a general rule, Democrats prefer more federal involvement in the government in society. One of the DOE's first initiatives was the development of solar research. Jimmy Carter was quoted as saying, "Nobody can embargo sunlight. No cartel controls the sun. Its energy will not run out. It will not pollute our air or poison our waters. It is free from stench and smog." That's a very progressive viewpoint for 1978. In 2020, solar energy is starting to be used more, and it feels like it's becoming more of a viable alternative to fossil fuels. But to propose this in 1978 and to work on developing it, that was well ahead of its time. The DOE sponsors more basic research in the physical sciences than any other federal agency. Education. And we'll talk more about education when we get to the state level. Federal rules on education certainly affect y'all's lives as students and mine as a teacher, but the city and county, the county really, probably, I think it's safe to say, has more of an impact on your actual day to day stuff. You know, things like school closures come at the state level, state and local level. The DOE, their mission is to foster excellence and equal access by establishing policies on federal financial aid for education, distribute and monitor financial aid, and collect data on the nation's schools. This is education, the Department of Education. It's not the Department of Finance or the Treasury. But you guys see that in terms of public education on the federal level, it really comes down to how much money they can and will provide and to whom they will provide it. It costs money to build and run public schools. And some communities just simply don't have the money to build and maintain adequate facilities. So ideally, the idea is that the federal government that the government will provide assistance. Jimmy Carter delivered a campaign promise when he was running for president. And by the way, guys, he actually announced his presidential campaign at a bar on River Street. I believe it's River Street. It's called like Pinky's, right here in Savannah. He promised to the National Education Association when he signed a bill establishing the Department of Education as the 13th cabinet level department in 1979. Before it was in the health department, Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. The first secretary of the DOE was a woman named Shirley Huffstedler. She was initially a candidate to be on the Supreme Court. Gerald Ford, the successor to Richard Nixon, um, nominated her to be on the Supreme Court, but that didn't work. She was a judge on the U.S. Court of Appeals, but she didn't get on the Supreme Court, and she wound up as head of the DOE instead. Veterans Affairs. It's a proud emblem. The mission for the Department of Veterans Affairs is to care for the nation's veterans, issue checks for disability, education, and pensions, and supervise national cemeteries. It was established in 1988 under Ronald Reagan. He signed legislation that established the Department of Veterans Affairs as a cabinet level department. There had been a Veterans Administration since 1930, but Reagan elevated them to the cabinet level, gave them a higher profile in the federal bureaucracy. The first secretary was appointed by George H.W. Bush, not George W., the original President Bush. He's going to name a guy named Edward Derwinski as the first secretary of the VA. Derwinski was a veteran, World War II, of course. It is the nation's second largest federal agency, so it's huge. These are older statistics, but in '08, they gave almost $40 billion in disability compensation, death compensation, and pension to 3.7 million people. That is a lot of people and a lot of money being divvied out by the VA. And Homeland Security. Speaking of George W. Bush, the mission of the Department of Homeland Security is to secure the country and preserve America's freedoms while preparing to respond to all hazards and disasters. The Office of Homeland Security was established to foster intelligence, information sharing in the aftermath of the terrorist attacks on September 11th, 2001. DHS became a cabinet level department under George W. Bush with the passing of the Homeland Security Act in 2002 and merged 22 agencies, including the Customs Service, U.S. Border Patrol, Coast Guard, and Secret Service. So this was created basically as a direct response to the 9/11 attacks. And I think that the reason the name homeland or the term homeland was used is that following those attacks, that was the first time we had been attacked on U.S. soil since Pearl Harbor. So there was, and it was in New York, no less. Sort of our capital is in D.C., but New York, in terms of on the world stage, is America's most high profile city. So the fact that not only were we attacked on our land, but that thousands of people died. There was right here at home. There was this fear among American people. So you put the word homeland, and this is just my own personal opinion. I think that's meant to send a message that, of protection. First secretary was Governor of Pennsylvania, former Governor Tom Ridge. Among the agencies that had operated as an independent agency, but that was absorbed by the DHS, by Homeland Security, was FEMA. You guys ever heard of that name, FEMA? It comes up quite a bit. So let's look back. Let's click on this, shall we? So FEMA, um, excuse me, FEMA stands for the Federal Emergency Management Agency. So in cases like where there's weather destruction, like hurricane destruction, or something like the coronavirus. And since that's such a major issue right now, let's look at what FEMA offers. Right, we have the CDC as well, the Center for Disease Control, who they're considered from a scientific point of view. They're who we're supposed to get our information from. But FEMA provides the aid. The CDC studies, researches, provides information. FEMA's the one that gives the aid. So let's look at what we're doing to support. What are you guys doing to support? Coordinating with the Department of Defense, basically sending emergency medical personnel, trying to divvy out protective equipment, masks and such. Funding the flight of cost, the flight cost of medicine and supplies. Trying to help testing. So basically, you can see they're trying to help. They're trying to do things logistically and financially that will help us out as we're dealing with this. It gets into where it gets ugly is different states fighting over who deserves FEMA dollars. You know how and the chief executive, excuse me, guys, deciding where he's going to allocate money. So, what I want to do is take a look at Robert Weaver. And we might do a feature him more in a future lesson. But right now, I just want to show a about a 5 minute clip. This is an interview Weaver did, and he's talking about FDR. So he's talking about the New Deal, the Great Depression. So I think it's topical for a number of reasons. First of all, former Secretary Weaver, as we talked about, was a major figure in African American history and in American history. And he happens to be talking about the most expansive and thorough. I don't know. I guess expansive expansion is probably is a bit redundant, but he happens to be talking about the biggest federal help effort ever undertaken.
What kind of opposition did you encounter in the Department of Interior in carrying out New Deal programs? Was there much opposition?
There was opposition in the changes, particularly in the older bureaucracy. You know, every bureaucracy, whether it's governmental or industrial or educational, builds up a series of principles. And anything that goes against those principles, they resist. They resist at first because it suggests that maybe they've been wrong. And they against it, secondly, because it is contrary to what they call conventional wisdom.
Did this resistance come from any particular camp or any particular? I mean, was there conservative resistance? I guess.
Well, it varied from branch to branch in the department. Some of the older departments and some of the older employees, and I'm speak older in the sense of tenure, not in the sense of how old they were by years, were very, very protective of doing things the way they had been done. All of them were defensive when they were told that they had to change something, because, as I said before, this implied that they'd been wrong before.
Now, FDR, and Stephen asked this question earlier, something similar. FDR needed the political support of Southern Democrats. Now, what constraints did this place on New Deal programs in terms of how far he was willing to push them, how liberal they could be, how progressive they could be?
Well, of course, it's obvious that FDR required the support from the Congress in order to get his legislation through. And it's obvious also that the Congress was largely influenced by the Southern contingents, and that there was a realization on his part and on the part of his staff that you could only go so far and maintain the support in general from the group that had the greatest influence, so that the Southern influence in the Congress certainly limited FDR as to how far he could go. Now, that doesn't mean that that was the only limitation to it. There was the fact that he was not a champion of civil rights, and that he did not have this high on his priority, nor did it seem to him that it was consistent with the other things that he wanted to do. In other words, if he could have done it without losing other things, he might have done it. But if it's meant losing something that he felt up as a greater importance, he would hesitate to do it.
Now, if you were explaining to a young person what it meant for you to be a part of the New Deal, what would you want them to understand?
Well, I would think that I would want them to understand that the New Deal represented a new situation vis-a-vis the importance of government in the lives of average citizens in this country. That the type of laissez-faire which had gone on after the Civil War with the great growth of American industry and whatnot was being clipped somewhat. And in that clipping, there were the seeds of getting new developments, new approaches, and new regulations, which would assist and help the people who were in need. And that included, of course, Black Americans.
Did you feel that you were part of a movement to make government more responsive?
Yes, but I didn't think that I was a major part of it. I thought that I was among those who were participating in that activity, but I didn't think I was the captain of the troops going over the hill.
That was great. All right, guys. With that, we're going to wrap it up. But before we do, well, that's all right. Wanted to show you guys my awesome mustache, but we'll go ahead and wrap it up there for today, guys. Good job.